Lord be with you. This is a reading of the Holy Gospel according to Luke. At that time, some who were present to hear Jesus preach told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with the pagan sacrifices once he killed them. And Jesus said in reply, "Do you think that these Galileans were the greatest sinners in Galilee just because they suffered this? By no means. But I tell you, you will all come to the same end unless you reform. Or take those 18 who were killed by a falling tower in Siloam. Do you think they were more guilty than anyone else who lived in Jerusalem? Certainly not. But I tell you, you will all come to the same end unless you begin to reform." He went on with a parable. He said, a man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard. He came out looking for fruit, did not find any. He said to his vine dresser, "Look here, for 3 years now I have come in search of fruit from this fig tree and found none. Cut it down. Why should it clutter up the ground?" The vine dresser answered him, "Sir, leave it another year while I hoe around it and manure it, and perhaps it will bear fruit. If not, it shall be cut down." Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The focus of my sermon this morning is going to be on that first reading of the burning bush, because it's one of those scriptures, particularly from the Old Testament, that from the time we were a small child with our picture Bible, we had a visual image of what the story was about, and and maybe never got beyond that image. Maybe just when we hear the burning bush, we just kind of go back to that visual and just kind of stay there. And so I went ahead and meditated on it at some length, and the length of the conversation that went on for 2 chapters. So we got about a paragraph, but really God had a lot more to say to Moses, and Moses back to God, than what we heard about. If you remember the story of Moses, about how he was miraculously rescued when Pharaoh had declared that all male Jewish boys would be killed and would not be allowed to live, and that he actually was rescued through his mother and his sister and Pharaoh's daughter, and he actually grew up in Pharaoh's household, which means he had the best of everything in Egypt, which was the place to be on the Mediterranean at that time. And but once he grew up, he evidently knew he had this kinship with his fellow Jews, and when he saw this Egyptian beating a Jew for no reason at all, he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand. And then when he reprimanded one of his fellow Jews the very next day, the fellow Jew said, "Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian?" So he was outed by his own deeds and taking law into his own hands, and so had to flee from Egypt, so he had to survive. The reason why I tell you that is it kind of serves as a backdrop for this appearance of God to Moses, where he fled, which was in Midian, married the daughter of the priest of Midian, Jethro, was herding sheep, and was now minding his own business. And God, who heard the cries of suffering and persecution of his own people, went all the way to Midian to get his instrument for saving his people. Okay. And so God's first revelation to Moses was to identify himself as, I am the God of your father Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the patriarchs, your ancestors. And I have heard the cry of my people. I have remembered them. I have remembered my covenants with your forebears. And I mean to rectify that and to give them justice and give them freedom and give them deliverance. And I'm going to send you to be my instrument to do that. So God is revealing several things of tremendous importance. No greater importance than that is who God is and how God perceives human beings and how God perceives human beings to which God has a commitment to them, and that God fulfills those commitments, fulfills those promises, and that God uses human instruments to do this. And these are by God's choice for God's reasons. Okay. And so Moses, who in his own way, some years back, had experienced the same thing in his own heart. He had felt compassion for his fellow Jews. He had tried what he could do to rectify that and failed, literally. That he, he took out one Egyptian and maybe saved one Hebrew, but he didn't stop the oppression, didn't stop the slavery, and literally had to run away to save his own life. And so Moses, I'm just trying to get inside the head of Moses, which is probably not a really bright thing to try to do, but is that he really had a good heart. And so God knew Moses' heart, but in the conversation that God has with Moses, Moses now has become a bit jaded, about this task. Well, what do you mean? Who am I that you're going to send me? That's like, did not want to go back. Why would you want to go back? There was a price on your head. So, who am I to go back and do this? I once thought I could. I couldn't. I'm done with it. I've moved on. Well, God hadn't. God was still on that. And so God says, well, I will be with you. Okay. Well, why weren't you with me the last time? Well, Moses didn't know God the last time. Moses was trying to fix things in his own way, by his own power, which is why it failed. Okay? And sometimes, I think, this is the message I'm getting, sometimes we have to face that. Sometimes we have to face that, well, maybe the reason why we didn't succeed is that we were trying to do it our own way and under our own power, and we weren't doing it in cooperation with God, and maybe we needed God more, and we weren't, more attentive, more trusting, more whatever with God. And so God basically is making promises now to Moses, this time it'll work, because I will be with you, and I will show you, and my power will be evident, and my wisdom will be evident. And every time Moses came up with, but what about this? What about this? What about this? He kept coming up with these very rational objections, arguments, conditions, and all of that. So you could just kind of hear his brain going through all these scenarios of how this could fail, which were all very reasonable. Without the power of God, without the wisdom of God, it was doomed to fail. It would never succeed. You're dealing with the power of Egypt. You're dealing with the the greatest empire of the Mediterranean world at that time. How are you going to beat them? You know? Had no clue. Had no clue. What becomes very evident throughout the conversation, that God is very patient with this, that God answers every one of Moses' questions, that God has an answer, you know, so God has already thought this all through. God was willing to put all of his power, his reputation, all of that on the line to make all of that succeed. And so it came down to Moses had no more objections except one. Send somebody else. That was his final objection. He said, send somebody else. Now, do you know what happens when you tell God that? It's like trying to tell my father that. When he told me to do something, you know, because I had other brothers. You know, what happens when you tell your father that, when he tells you to go do something? She's got a smile from Jackson on that one. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. So much for free will. I was I was meditating on that a little bit. I thought, no, don't bring that up in the sermon, Bob. You'll paint yourself in a corner in a heartbeat. So just forget I said that. To me, the conversation is very important, and particularly in the time of Lent, because it is the time when obviously we are more attentive to prayer and fasting and works of justice and of charity. And is that when we feel that prayer is just of our initiative, then we might just be prone to not getting beyond our own side of the conversation. When we feel like the prayer is just my initiative, I might not get beyond my side of the conversation. When we are mindful that God is really the initiator of all prayer. You know, we thought we got ourselves here to church this morning. Okay, we didn't. You know, God really got us here. God's grace brought us here to church today. And so God is initiating whatever this prayer moment is. And God always initiates for the purpose of revealing God's self to us and drawing out a response beyond beyond the objections, whether rational, irrational, whatever they are, whatever our hesitations are, whatever our fears are, whatever our anxieties are, is that God is drawing us beyond them. So we can know this is not just about me. This is not just about me. This is about God. This is about God's plans. This is about God's purpose and where I fit into that. And I'm not the one who has already set that up. God is. You know, so free will has to fit into a God-centered world. You know, God is the creator, God is the redeemer, and God is the sanctifier. So if God is all of that, then whatever free will we have has to fit into that world. Okay? And that does take some conversation. That does take some interchange. And it certainly takes our listening and our learning. Okay? And if there's anything Lent is about, it's about listening